Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad, and I am joined today by two remarkable political scientists, my co-host Lisa Wedeen and John Mearsheimer, both professors at University of Chicago, who will be introduced shortly. This is part of our Gaza in Context project, and we are delighted to have Professor Mearsheimer with us to discuss genocide in Gaza, dimensions of an unfolding catastrophe. We also want to point out that all of the previous 17 or 18 teachings, as well as the podcast, are available at palestineincontext.org. And we appreciate the support of the 22 collaborators, so to speak, our co organizers hailing from 22 universities and research centers all around the world. And we aim to continue this project so long as the killing is going on, and also perhaps beyond, so that we can provide pedagogical material for those interested in learning more or teaching and assigning this material. I will start by introducing my co-host, Professor Lisa Wedeen, who is the Mary Morton Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the College, Director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and Associate Faculty in Anthropology at the University of Chicago. Her publications include three books: Ambiguities of Domination, a seminal book in the 1990s on Syria, subtitled Politics, Rhetoric, and Symbols in Contemporary Syria; Peripheral Visions, Publics, Power, and Performance in Yemen; and more recently, Authoritarian Apprehensions, Ideology, Judgment, and Mourning in Syria. For this newest book, she has received 4 awards. Wedeen's co-edited volume with Joseph Masco, entitled Conspiracy/Theory, was just published this month, in January 2024. She is beginning work on a new book on revolutionary disappointment. Lisa, I will give you the floor right now to carry on and introduce Professor Mearsheimer and lead the first question.
Thank you. Thank you, Bassam. And Bassam Haddad is founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, an associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He's the author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience. And it is my pleasure as well to introduce John J. Mearsheimer, who is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1982. He graduated from West Point, has a PhD in political science from Cornell University, and has written extensively about security issues and international politics. Among his 7 books are The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, 2001, reprinted 2014, which won the Joseph Lepgold Book Prize and has been translated into 9 languages. The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy with Stephen M. Walt, 2007, made the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 25 languages. And The Great Delusion, Liberal Ideals and International Realities, 2008, which won the 2019 Best Book of the Year Award from the Valdai Discussion Conference, Moscow, and has been translated into 9 languages. His latest book is How States Think: The Rationality of Foreign Policy with Sebastian Rosato. That's 2023. He has also written numerous articles and op-eds that have appeared in International Security, The Economist, the London Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, the Financial Times, and the New York Times. In 2003, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2020, he won the James Madison Award, which is given once every 3 years by the American Political Science Association to, quote, an American political scientist who has made a distinguished scholarly contribution to political science. Thanks for being here with us. So we're going to start with a question that is particularly current at the moment, John. South Africa recently filed, as you know, an 84-page brief at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, arguing that Israel's military campaign in Gaza violates its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention, which defines genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, unquote. So South Africa alleges that Israel's actions are, quote, genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part, unquote, of the Palestinian population in the enclave. The hearing is scheduled for January 11th in The Hague, as many viewers know, and Israel is claiming that the allegations are, quote, baseless, unquote. Now, you've written about the brief in a piece entitled Genocide in Gaza, and we'd like to ask you first to walk us through the arguments you make in that piece.
Well, the first point that readers want to keep in mind is that the South African document, it's called an attachment. The South African document really has three parts to it, all designed to make the case that what Israel is doing in Gaza is a case of genocide. The first part is that they go to great lengths to show genocidal intent. Then, second, they go to great lengths to show that what Israel has actually done so far in Gaza is consistent with genocidal intent. In other words, the amount of death and destruction that we see and the system that we see in place for future conflict there in Gaza is consistent with genocidal intent. So that's the actions part of the story, and that's the second part. And then the third part is they put Israel's behavior into a broader context. They look at how the Israelis treated the Gazan Palestinians and how they talked about the Gazan Palestinians before October 7th of last year. So those are the three parts of the document that South Africa has put forth before the International Court of Justice. And I would strongly urge everybody who's listening to this podcast to read the document. It's readily available online, and it is a very impressive piece of work. It is thoroughly documented. It is carefully written. It is carefully argued. And I believe that it makes a compelling case that Israel is in the early stages of a genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza.
Would you say more about why you think it makes the case so forcefully and how this is different than other kinds of claim making that's going on?
Well, first of all, if you read the section, which goes from page 59 to 69, that deals with genocidal intent, and you listen to what the Israeli prime minister, the Israeli president, the defense minister, and all sorts of other ministers in the government and high level generals are saying about the Palestinians, how they think about the Palestinians, and what they intend to do in Gaza, it's hard not to believe that this is manifest evidence of genocidal intent. They talk about the Palestinians as human animals, sons of dogs. They say the most horrible things about the Palestinians. And we're not just talking about Hamas here. We're talking about what they have to say about the Palestinians in general. And then if you look at what they say about what they want to do in Gaza, it's quite clear that they are interested in basically obliterating the Palestinians in Gaza. And again, it's very important to emphasize that these comments are not being made by deranged people who aren't in the government or by, some people on the street. These are statements that are being made by the leaders in the present Israeli government and by many former leaders as well. So it's very easy, in my opinion, to show genocidal intent. And if I can just take this a step further, Omer Bartov, who is an Israeli-born historian of the Holocaust at Brown University, a distinguished scholar, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in 2023. I believe it was in December, maybe late November 2023, where he said that the Israelis have genocidal intent. He was making the point then that the Israelis had not begun to engage in a genocidal campaign. But he was arguing, and I don't see how anyone can deny this, that the Israelis have genocidal intent based on what they are saying about the Palestinians and what they plan to do in Gaza. So that's just a very important element of the story. And then if you take it a step further and you look at what the Israelis are actually doing in Gaza, it's really mind-boggling. It's just hard to believe how much death and destruction they have already inflicted on the Palestinians in Gaza. And very importantly, I cannot stress this enough, if you project forward, if you think about where this one is headed, there is very good reason to think that the death and destruction is going to increase, maybe even exponentially. Now, you say to yourself, why does John say that? There are really two reasons. First of all, if you look at what the Israelis have done to the medical system and in Gaza, destroying hospitals, destroying ambulances, and so forth and so on, and you look at the fact that they are going to great lengths to prevent medicine, water, food, and fuel from coming into Gaza, what you have is a situation where we are on the verge of massive deaths from disease and from starvation. All the human rights and associated groups that are in Gaza are emphasizing this point on a daily basis. So you have potential for real disaster because of starvation and because of disease. Furthermore, on Christmas Day, December 25th of 2023, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that we are going to deepen the campaign. In other words, they're going to ramp up this bombing campaign against the Palestinians. And he said, furthermore, it's going to go on for a long time. He made it clear that this war is far from over. So if you look at what's happened in Gaza since October 7th, and then you project forward and think about doing this for more and more months, right? Lots more people are going to die. And when you go back to the whole issue of genocidal intent and you marry that to the actions that the Israelis have already taken and they're talking about taking in the future, I think all the ingredients are there for making the case that the Israelis are engaged in genocide.
Thanks, John. So, which also makes it that much more mind-boggling on another front, where the administration, the Biden administration, has already rejected South Africa's claims. As the White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby noted, we find, and I quote, we find the submission meritless, counterproductive, and completely without basis in fact whatsoever, which is a very emphatic insistence. What is the U.S. doing here? How does it fit into the broader foreign policy agenda of the United States, and what kind of implications might this have for the U.S.'s already tarnished, to put it very mildly, reputation in the region?
Well, first of all, Kirby's comments are ridiculous. They're just ridiculous. You can agree, you can disagree with the report. All three of us operate in a world where we understand that if somebody writes a report, you're free to disagree. You can try to poke holes in it. But the argument that this is sort of this report's comprised of baseless charges is laughable. If you look at that report, you look at the footnotes, it's in the end, it's hard to see how the Israelis are going to defend themselves, to be honest. But to say it's baseless is ludicrous. With regard to the Americans, the problem that the Americans have is that they're complicitous in this campaign that the Israelis are waging in Gaza. The Biden administration is backing the Israelis to the hilt. And if you look at the Genocide Convention, complicity is considered to be a crime. It's right there. in the Genocide Convention of 1948. So it's not only the Israelis who are in the docket here, it's also the Americans. So it's unsurprising that the Biden administration and the Israelis are working overtime to make sure that this South African case does not go too far.
But this sort of begs the question, why is the Biden administration being so unequivocally supportive of Israel, even circumventing Congress to get more weapons to Israel? And what's the relationship between this support and United States domestic politics?
Well, there's no question that given the Israel lobby, any president of the United States would have to back Israel to some extent in this campaign. No president is going to get really tough on Israel in a situation like this. No president's going to get tough on Israel in hardly any circumstances, for that matter, because of the power of the Israel lobby. But this is more than that, and it has a lot to do with how Joe Biden thinks about Israel. The fact is, Joe Biden has a passionate attachment to Israel that bears no resemblance to the attachment that any other American president might have had. I think Bill Clinton was very sympathetic to Israel, for sure, but he did not have an attachment, a passionate attachment that even compares to Joe Biden. And this is all laid out rather nicely in a piece, a recent piece that's easily accessible on the internet that was in the magazine Mother Jones, which I would encourage everybody to go out and read. And it talks at great length about Joe Biden's thinking on Israel. And when you finish that article, you fully understand why he is backing Israel to the hilt.
Do you think that this strategy is going to affect upcoming? I mean, it's clearly going to have some effect, but what kind of effect is it going to have on upcoming US elections?
I think it's highly likely that this is going to hurt Biden and may hurt him badly. I mean, first of all, you want to remember that Biden barely beat Trump in 2020, and Trump has very impressive numbers relative to Biden at this point in time. And if that's the case in 2024, in November of this year, that could spell real trouble for Biden. It's quite clear that the Arab American community is infuriated with Biden, and that may mean that he will lose Michigan, which is a critical swing state. Furthermore, if you look at how younger people in the United States think about Biden's handling of the Gaza conflict, it's clearly highly critical of him. And he could lose a lot of young voters. And given again that it was close in 2020 and should be close in 2024, it could mean that he'll be pushed out of office.
Thank you, John. You've written alongside with Steve Walt, a famous controversial book by U.S. standards about the Israel lobby's influence in the U.S. In what ways do recent developments address the substance of your book, and what would you change or update given hindsight, if at all, if anything?
Well, I think if we were to write the book again, we would leave the basic framework intact. And all of the evidence we presented has clearly stood the test of time, at least in my opinion. I've not seen anybody challenge the evidence. I think what's happened since we wrote the book in 2017 is that there has been more and more evidence available to support the book. If we were to rewrite the book or write another version of the book now, the problem we would face, it would have to be a 5 or 6 volume set of books. I mean, you couldn't do it all in one volume like we did in 2007. There's just so much evidence of the lobby at work in the American political system. I would note that when we wrote the book, up to that point, most of what the lobby did was not highly visible to most people in the American body politic. And therefore, when the book came out, a lot of people were actually quite shocked by the story that we were telling. I think since 2007, the lobby has been forced to operate out in the open in ways that it didn't operate in that open before 2007. I like to say that the Israelis, or the Israel lobby, excuse me, the Israel lobby is now forced to play smash mouth politics, right? And you saw this in the case of Claudine Gay and the president of Penn, both of whom have been forced to resign, in large part because of the efforts of the lobby. This is obvious to almost everybody as to what happened. It's obvious to almost everybody as to what happened here. Everybody can see the lobby at work, and therefore it wouldn't be very surprising if we wrote another book and told people about the lobby's influence. The real problem here is not that people don't know what the lobby is doing, and it's not that lots of people are not deeply disturbed by what the lobby is doing. I believe many academics, for certain, are terribly upset about how the lobby uh, played a key role in pushing these two university presidents overboard. The problem is that most people are afraid to speak up about the lobby. Most people are afraid to publicly go toe to toe with the lobby. And the end result is that even though the lobby is now playing smash mouth politics, it's out in the open, they can get away with it because nobody or hardly anybody will stand up and say that this is bad and it needs to be stopped.
How how do you view the gap between where the U.S. administration is, with or without the lobby, and the popular mood, vote, opinion, and will there be any sort of catch up in the coming future, given this level of untold destruction and barbarism that's taking place? Will there be a potential catch up in terms of the government and the people's gap sort of closing, not least in the past few weeks, because early on the public mood was nothing near where it is today. Is this gap something that is just a structural gap and is likely to continue when we go back to business as usual, or do you think these past few months and Israel's behavior and the US unflinching support at the very top is going to actually cause some sort of changes, not necessarily tectonic shifts, but some sort of changes in US foreign policy on this particular question? Or does it depend on who's in the White House and which party is leading? Or does that matter at all?
This is a fascinating question. And Steve and I, when we wrote the article first in 2006 and then the book in 2007, it took us a while to get our hands around this whole issue. What we discovered, not right off the bat, but what we eventually discovered is that there is a quite marked difference in how the public at large thinks about Israel and how the elites, especially the governing elites, but the elites more generally, talk about Israel and the policies that we formulate. And there's much more skepticism, much less attachment to Israel in the wider body politic. There's just no question about that. And it's certainly true inside the Democratic Party, and that's been true for quite a while. But nevertheless, if you look at the elites and how they behave towards Israel, they all talk as if they have a passionate attachment to Israel and they'll do anything to protect Israel and they'll never cut off aid to Israel and so forth and so on. So there's this real disjuncture between the elites and the public. The key to understanding how the lobby works is that they focus most of their attention on the elites. What they're really interested in doing is putting tremendous pressure on people who formulate policy, both in the executive branch and in Congress. And they want to create a situation where everybody lives in fear of being what I call Corbynized. This is what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was the Labour leader in Britain, and he was critical of Israel. And what the lobby in Britain did was they waged a highly successful campaign to portray him as one of the world's great anti-Semites. And they basically ended his career as a politician as a result of their effective campaign. And American policymakers live in fear that the lobby will target them and ruin their political career, and even make it hard for them to get jobs outside of government. So you have a situation where basically the lobby is able to influence policy in profound ways because of its influence with the elites. There are limits to what they can do with the public, but there, the basic name of the game is just to make sure that the public is not too hostile to Israel. And this is why the lobby goes to such great lengths to control the discourse. Right? What's going on university campuses is that these are places, these are institutions, these colleges and universities where it's, as we all know, very hard to control the discourse. And this can be dangerous because you don't want the public discourse to get too hostile to Israel. It can be somewhat hostile. You can have problems in the Democratic Party, but you got to keep it in certain bounds. And the place where you really run the risk that things will get out of hand from the lobby's point of view or from Israel's point of view is on college and university campuses. So that's why they pay so much attention to what's going on at these places. But really, what's going on at a more general level is that you're just trying to control the public discourse to keep the public at bay. And you're concentrating, again, most of your fire at the elite level, especially with regard to people who are in the White House or with people who are in Congress. And the truth is, the lobby is extremely effective at executing this policy. You can dislike it, and I dislike it for sure, but there's no question that they are very good at what they do.
I have another follow-up question from what you've just said. There's a tremendous amount of attention in the press these days about donors with regard to university campuses, about billionaires and their effects on policy more generally. And what's the relationship between the concentration of money and the lobby?
Well, money is terribly important. There's no question about that. If you're
But I
a
mean,
university,
the relationship between these elites, billionaires, and the lobby, because they're not exactly the same thing, right?
I'm not too sure I understand what you're saying.
So, for example, there's been a tremendous amount of press recently about Ackman. You mentioned the Claudine Gay affair, and that has less attention on the lobby and more on, I don't know, his role as trustee or whatever he is. But my question is more: what is the lobby is doing a lot of work for you in the analysis, and I'm wondering if there are other factors too, or whether they're kind of the same factor.
Well, they're basically the same factor. Ackman is deeply committed. He's passionately committed to Israel. And he is a huge donor to Harvard University. And he's basically made it clear that if Harvard doesn't change how it handles discourse about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, then he'll pull his money. And of course, the implication is that all sorts of other people will pull their money. And this will have hugely negative consequences for Harvard University. And of course, you saw the same game being played at the University of Pennsylvania. So what you have here is you have a large number of individuals with a passionate attachment to Israel who have deep pockets and who have given in the past huge amounts of money to these institutions, and they threaten to take that money away. And it's well understood that they'll talk to other people as well, who are passionately attached to Israel and who give money to the Harvards and Penns of the world. And that money will be cut off too, or reduced to $1 a year. And the end result is great damage will be done to the university. So any university president is going to be extremely nervous about alienating people like Ackman. This is how the lobby operates. It's not the only way the lobby operates. Money is part of the story, but it's not just money. It's influence in the media, and so forth and so on.
Thanks. I have another question pivoting a little bit now. Mary Robinson, who was the former president of Ireland and former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said that the United States is losing respect and credibility with its current politics. Many would argue that the United States didn't deserve this respect or credibility in the first place. Others would say that it hasn't had it for a long time, if it ever did. We can all agree here that the US has historically operated with, we in this conversation at least can agree that the United States has historically operated with double standards. It's supported dictatorships while championing democracy, endorsed peace while fighting wars, claimed to respect international borders and human rights while violating them, and the list can go on and on. So my question here is threefold. And the first part of it is, how much of United States foreign policy can also be understood? We've talked about the lobby, but how much can also be understood through the lens of its military-industrial complex?
I would just start off by saying I have long argued that the United States is a ruthless great power. In fact, I think by definition, great powers are ruthless, and this includes the United States. And I agree with much of what you just said about how we have behaved over time. As you well know, we overthrew lots of democracies in the Middle East and other places during the Cold War. So I understand how ruthless the United States is. How much does the military-industrial complex explain of this behavior? I've never thought much, to be honest. I think the military-industrial complex is obviously very interested in having a big defense budget and therefore making lots of money. But I've never seen a whole heck of a lot of evidence that the MIC pushes the United States to be highly aggressive overseas. One could argue that our aggressive policies play very nicely for the MIC because that allows them to get a lot of money from the government. You can make that argument, but I've never seen much evidence that the MIC is really driving America's ruthless behavior abroad. And I think, by the way, with regard to the case that we're talking about, American Middle East policy, especially as it relates to Israel, I don't think the MIC has that much to do with it. I think the lobby really matters here. I think if you go to East Asia, for example, and you talk about the U.S.-China competition, I think the MIC has, a considerable amount of influence there. And I don't think the Israel lobby has much influence with regard to our policies in East Asia. So it somewhat depends on which area of the world that you're looking at. But I would just say, Lisa, I don't think the MIC matters that much. I think what drives America's ruthlessness is in good part our realist inclinations. I think, realist logic explains how great powers behave, and realist logic pushes states to behave sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in brutal ways. I also think that this would come as a surprise to many Americans, but I think our liberalism leads to brutal policies. I think if you look at how we behaved during the unipolar moment, I think we basically went around the world trying to topple governments and put in their place liberal regimes. We were doing social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel. The amount of death and destruction that we caused in the greater Middle East is mind-boggling, in my opinion. I don't believe that was driven in large part by realist logic. I believe it was driven in good part by liberal thinking. Also, the global war on terror mattered here. So I think there are a lot of factors at play, but I would not ascribe much influence to the MEC.
But the realist logic that you underscore and that has been a major part of your career seems to be somewhat at odds with the Biden administration's overwhelming support for Israel. This can't be good for the United States in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, when Steve and I wrote the Israel Lobby book, as you well know, since Steve was your colleague for a while as well as mine, Steve and I are both realists. Okay. He has a different realist theory of the world than I do. So we have different realist theories, but we're both realists. And when the book came out, or first when the article came out, then when the book came out, a lot of people took pleasure in saying to both of us, don't you two realize that the argument that you're making in the lobby paper or the lobby book contradicts your realist theory of international politics? You say that states are supposed to act in ways that are strategically smart, but what you're saying in your work on the Israel lobby is that that's not true, that domestic politics is pushing the United States to act in strategically and morally foolish ways. And our response to that was, you're exactly right. The Israel lobby argument that Steve and I make contradicts both of our theories.
You also mentioned in your response to the initial question, or the initial fifth question's first fold, 9/11. And I wonder how the United States' approach to foreign policy since 9/11 has changed. And if you see the Biden administration in lockstep with these changes, or are there novel aspects that we need to pay attention to at the moment?
Well, I think that it's important to start by noting that 9/11 took place during the unipolar moment. The United States in 2001 was the only great power in the system, and it was Godzilla. It was incredibly powerful. And when 9/11 happened, what we did is we basically went on a rampage. And many people now look back at what we did and they argue we overreacted. Of course, they're correct. And this overreaction was codified in the global war on terror. And as you remember, George Bush said that we were going to basically eradicate terrorism from the face of the earth, right? This was a ludicrous charge, but it helped lead us to go here, there, and everywhere to slay dragons, right? And that was our focus. And I would note, Lisa, that there was no focus in those years after 9/11 on great power politics because there was only one great power in the system. It was the unipolar moment. And during the unipolar moment, you can't have great power politics because there's only one great power, by definition, in other words. What happens around 2017, right around that time frame, the world begins to move away from unipolarity to multipolarity. You have the resurrection of Russian power under Vladimir Putin, and China rises to the point where in 2017, it's effectively another great power. So today we talk about a multipolar world, and we talk about a system where there are three great powers, which is very different than the world that existed in 2001 and for a good 15 plus years after that. And today the United States is principally concerned with the rise of China, and to a lesser extent it's deeply concerned with the war in Ukraine. So it's important to emphasize that the Gaza war is a huge distraction for the United States. And the last thing the United States wants is for the war in the Middle East to escalate. From an American point of view, the best situation that could obtain in the Middle East is one of peace and stability, so that the United States didn't have to pay much attention to the Middle East or the greater Middle East and could focus instead on East Asia. But that's not happened. And this is just more evidence of the extent to which Israel is a strategic liability for the United States. Israel gets the United States, in this case, into deep trouble in Gaza. And if this war escalates in the Middle East, we're going to be even more deeply involved in conflict in this region, which is not something that we want. So, my basic point to you is that it's important to understand that the world that existed at the time of 9/11 is very different than the world that exists today. And the situation in the Middle East, especially with regard to Gaza, is disastrous for the United States.
Thanks, John. I'm going to bring us back a bit to what's happening with the situation on the ground and the ICJ, starting with an event or I guess, an assassination that just took place uh, yesterday in Lebanon, where Israel killed a high-level operative or leader in South Lebanon from Hezbollah. Uh, so this is the just a background. My question is: we keep seeing the United States trying hard to avoid, at least rhetorically, to avoid the escalation of this war into something regional and potentially beyond. And at the same time, we keep observing Israel doing the opposite and trying to test the limits of specifically Hezbollah, because it's the main player here at this point. How do we explain? How would you explain the motives of each party, and why they're moving in this direction? If you agree that, for the most part, that this is what we might be witnessing, what is driving Israel's continued provocation in the north, even though they might claim it's the reverse that's taking place? And what are the exact concerns of the United States in terms of wanting or appearing to want to avoid an escalation?
Yeah, let me just start with the United States because that's easy to deal with. As I just said, the United States does not want escalation in the Middle East. It simply does not. Indeed, I think the United States would like to see the Israelis win, whatever that means, in Gaza, end that war, so that we have a stable Middle East. That's the American goal. No escalation. The Israelis are a different matter. Uh, First point I would make there is I actually believe the Israelis wouldn't mind a general conflagration because that would facilitate ethnic cleansing. I think the Israelis are interested in cleansing not only Gaza, where they've made their views manifestly clear in recent months, but I think they're also interested in cleansing the West Bank. And a general conflagration would make it easier for them to do it. I'm not saying they could succeed at cleansing both places, but it would make it easier. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people who in Israel who want escalation for that reason. I think the other reason they want escalation, which I have no doubt about, uh, is that they have a huge problem on their northern border, the border with Hezbollah. Uh, Most accounts say that there are about 200,000 Israelis who have been displaced from their homes, either in northern Israel or in southern Israel. And of course, it's the Gaza conflict in southern Israel that explains what's going on there. So let's say there are 100,000 people from southern Israel who have been displaced by the Gaza conflict. There are another 100,000 who have been displaced by what's going on in the north. And this is a huge problem for the Israelis. And the question is, how do they move those people back to northern Israel until the conflict with Hamas excuse me, until the conflict with Hezbollah is settled and Hezbollah stops firing rockets, missile, and artillery rounds into northern Israel. Well, as long as the war in Gaza goes on, I believe the Hezbollah will continue to target northern Israel, again, because of what's going on in Gaza. So, what the Israelis would like to do is they would like to use military force. They'd like to escalate. They think they have escalation domination here or escalation dominance here. I think they'd like to escalate against Hezbollah, inflict massive punishment on not only Hezbollah, but Lebanon more generally, and work out some sort of modus vivendi with Hezbollah that allows them to move those 100,000 or so Israelis back to northern Israel. So I think that's what's going on. And I think it's a very dangerous situation. I think the Americans understand that. And given that the Americans don't want escalation, I think this is why they're putting great pressure on Israel not to escalate the war against Hezbollah.
Do you think there's any value to the idea that, given the scale of atrocities that the Israeli government knows is being witnessed by the world, and given the events of October 7th, on whose basis the Israeli military is carrying out these daily massacres and genocide, do you think there's merit to the argument that they might feel that they will not have another opportunity to go all out and are trying to make the best of this, plus what is going on politically in Israel, especially with the Prime Minister Netanyahu's situation, whereby this is viewed as a unique opportunity, or is this not necessarily part of the potential insistence on provoking and potentially expanding the war?
Yeah, let me make two observations, Bassam. The first is I actually find it stunning the extent to which Israelis across the board don't seem to care about Palestinian deaths. It's really quite remarkable. And I think it has to do with the fact that over time, the Israelis, almost all of them, have ended up dehumanizing the Palestinians. I believe that most Israelis just think that the Palestinians deserve what they're getting. There's remarkably little sympathy for what's happening to the Palestinians inside of Israel. And by the way, there's remarkably little sympathy for what's happening to the Palestinians among Israel's supporters in the West, which I must say I also find quite shocking. One can make an argument that there should be no sympathy among Israel's supporters or among Israelis for Hamas. One can understand that argument. But when you look at what's being done to the civilian population, to all those women and children, it's just sickening, and it doesn't seem to bother the Israeli public. I mean, there are certainly exceptions to that, Gideon Levy and so forth and so on, but not many exceptions. And here in the United States and in Western Europe, you see a similar situation. So I think it's quite shocking. And you want to, by the way, ask yourself then, what does this mean for the future? For the next couple months, the next couple of years, where is this train going? I often ask myself that. As bad as things are now, things can get much worse. Anyway, that's my first point. Second point I would make to you is I do believe that the Israelis see this as an opportunity. There have been, as you know better than I, two big cases of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in the past. The first was in 1948, and the second was in 1967 on the West Bank. And both of those cases of ethnic cleansing took place in the context of a war. And if you look at what's happening now, we obviously have a war. And it's hardly surprising that all of a sudden people are talking about ethnic cleansing. I believe before October 7th, there's no question that in the back of their minds, most Israeli elites thought seriously about ethnic cleansing. They thought about it because ethnic cleansing was a way of solving the apartheid problem, right? The fact that there were so many Palestinians inside Greater Israel and Israel needed an apartheid state to deal with that problem meant that they had to find a solution. And ethnic cleansing, I believe, most Israelis understood, most Israeli elites understood, was the solution to the apartheid problem. So before October 7th, they thought about it, but they fully understood that the opportunity to make ethnic cleansing work was simply not there. But as soon as October 7th happens, it's on the front burner because people understand you have a war taking place. And in a war, there may be an opportunity to cleanse the Palestinians, at least in Gaza. And I believe that the initial campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza, the Palestinians, was aimed at pushing the Palestinians out of Gaza. They were interested, the Israelis were interested in ethnic cleansing from the beginning. And just to take this one step further and repeat something I said a few minutes ago, I believe that the Israelis would not mind at all a general war in the Middle East that involved Lebanon, maybe even Iran, because the more widespread the war, the more widespread the fighting, the greater the opportunity for ethnic cleansing. And it's manifestly clear that the Israelis are very interested in ethnic cleansing at this point in time. Again, to go back where we started, as the South African application to the ICJ makes very clear.
Well, now that you brought up the ICJ, do you believe there is any credibility to Israel's counter arguments at the ICJ regarding the accusation of genocide? And, the reverse, what would have to be demonstrated, in your opinion, for the ICJ to rule against Israel, provided the ICJ is not politicized?
Well, the initial Israeli reaction has been somewhat like Admiral Kirby's reaction to say this is all baseless, it's based on myths, and so forth and so forth and so on. But of course, the Israelis or the Israeli government goes a step further and says this is an example of a blood libel, this is anti-Semitism at play. The usual charges that are leveled when anybody criticizes Israeli behavior. I don't think this is going to work. I think that the Israelis are going to have to try to make a factual case if this goes into the court, and they have a rational legal hearing. The Israelis will have to counter the 84-page report. As I said to you before, I may be missing something, but I've spent a huge chunk of my life thinking about how to make arguments and how to knock down arguments. And I've read that document 3 times, the South African application. I've read it 3 times. And I think the Israelis are going to have one whale of a difficult time knocking it down in a rational legal way. In fact, I would argue that it's almost impossible. I may be wrong, but that's my judgment. What's going to happen here is pretty straightforward, in my opinion. The United States and the Israelis will go to great lengths to make sure that if there is a hearing, which they will go to great lengths to prevent, if there is a hearing, that it is settled on political grounds, not rational legal grounds. We all know how international law and international institutions work. This is my realist logic at play. The great powers write the rules, they write the laws, they obey them when it's in their interest, and when it's not in their interest, they disobey them or they rewrite the rules. This is just the way it works. I mean, the United States basically wrote the 1948 Genocide Convention. And most of the time, we like the Genocide Convention. We think it's a good thing. Uh, but when we don't think it's a good thing, we'll do everything to use our power, to use our power to subvert the judicial process. And one could point to countless examples of this process at play, and not only involving the United States, but involving other great powers as well. It's the way the system works. One can argue that that's regrettable for sure, but it is the way the system works. So I think from the Israelis' perspective and from the Americans' perspective, the best way to deal with this is through raw power politics and to do everything possible to politicize the process and use America's power to undermine a rational legal process.
In the past few days, Israel ramped up its bombardment and led to the killing of and injury of several hundred people, and probably a lot more in the category of the injured. Uh, does this seem to be odd just days before the beginning of the hearing, or is there a notion of how potentially either the hearing will not go the way of South Africa, or that it will be not binding in some way? I mean, the ICJ, of course, is different from all of the other institutions, especially given the signatories to the ICJ, including Israel. Is there something that we're missing here with the ramping up of the massacres just days before, or they just don't care?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I don't think they care. I think they believe that the United States will protect them. And I think they're probably right. There's no question the United States will try to protect them. The United States, as I said much earlier in our conversation, has
Implicated.
a vested interest in protecting them because the United States is complicit, right? It's not like the United States is an innocent bystander here. The United States is deeply complicit in what the Israelis are doing. So we don't want this one to go very far in the ICJ. And the United States is very powerful. And as I said before, and Lisa said before, we are a ruthless great power. The United States is a ruthless great power. We will go to great lengths to use our power to undermine the process. And the Israelis know that. The Israelis know that they can pretty much get away with anything, and we'll defend them no matter what. And that again gets back to our earlier conversation about Joe Biden. Joe Biden will certainly defend them. So I think they just don't care.
So I have two follow-up questions to what you just said as well. And I know we're running out of time, but very quickly, do you think this is going to mean that the ICJ is going to be deauthorized on some level through this process? Or that it won't matter in the way that it's mattered before, as Bassam was saying, it has a kind of authority that other kinds of international organizations of the same ilk do not. Is this going to ultimately come back to bite them, given the fact that Israel doesn't really care, or it cares but it doesn't care, and it will continue to pursue its ruthless ethnic genocidal cleansing in Gaza, and perhaps, as you're suggesting, expand that operation into more of the West Bank? And the second question, is there anything that Israel would do? Can you conceive of anything that Israel would do that the United States would put its powerful foot down and say, no, stop right now, or we're going to withdraw military support, we're going to withdraw aid, we're going to withdraw our kind of unequivocal endorsement of Israel?
Yeah. With regard to your first question, I think there's no doubt that if the United States and Israel are able to prevent the ICJ from acting in a rational legal way, that will damage the ICJ. Uh, it won't damage it that much because I think the expectations here are not that great. I think that most people understand that international courts have limited power, especially when you're dealing with a great power. They just don't have much of an ability to coerce countries like the United States. The United States can play hardball with an international institution like the ICJ and win almost everybody every time, and people understand that. So the expectations are not that great, and therefore I think the damage, and there will be damage, but I don't think it will be that great. With regard to your second question, I mean, this is a question Steve and I often talked about, and I think about a lot. I would just note that what are we talking about here today? We're talking about genocide. We're talking about Israel committing genocide. And we're basically saying that there's this report out there that is really well written that documents a case that Israel is committing genocide and that the United States is complicitous. And there's no doubt that as the Israelis go forward with their campaign in Gaza, up to this point, all the evidence is that we'll support them no matter what. Uh, Now, maybe that situation will change, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. I think if Israel continues down this road, it's difficult to imagine the United States playing hardball with them. But I mean, I really hope that I'm wrong. I hope that the Americans wake up and put an end to this sooner rather than later. But, what can be worse than genocide, Lisa? Nothing that I can think of. If you believe the Israelis are committing genocide, or let's say you don't believe they're committing genocide, they're just engaging in mass murder. Uh, it's not genocide for one reason or another. Let's say you believe that. You would think that the United States would put its foot down and say, enough is enough mass murder. And if you believe it's genocide, you would think that we would move in and put an end to it. But there's no evidence of that. So I think we have a situation where Israel thinks, for good reason, it can do almost anything, and it will get support from the United States. And by the way, you don't want to lose sight of the fact that much of that support comes from the fact that we have this powerful lobby in the United States, the Israel lobby, that goes to great lengths to make sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. You want to understand that word unconditionally really matters. What the lobby is interested in doing is pushing the United States to support Israel no matter what it does. And as Steve and I document in the book, and as I think many people now know, the lobby is wildly successful in pursuit of that goal. And the end result is where we are today, and why I sadly have to answer your question, Lisa, by saying I can't imagine there's anything they would do that would cause us to put our foot down. But I do want to conclude my answer to your question by saying I hope I'm wrong. I hope we do put our foot down.
Thank you, John.
Thanks. Uh, Lisa, I'll if you have a follow up, go ahead. But
No, 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 no,
okay.
no. Thank you.
I
I'm willing to take a follow up question or another question if you
I
want.
oh, don't worry. We're good. If you're here, we're here. Um, I want to ask a question that will begin wrapping up, and that is, do you think, and we've kind of addressed this a bit earlier in our conversation, do you think the events of the past 3 months in total might constitute a fundamental shift in terms of the support for Israel here in the United States, as a sort of a conclusory set of comments that you might share with us, both at the political and popular levels? And where do you believe in connection with that, the line might be drawn in terms of the limits of U.S. policymakers' support for Israel in actuality, not just rhetorically. Because, for instance, on the question of illegal settlements, the U.S. opposition to that policy is evident rhetorically, but there are very few consequences that are carried out as the policy continues. So this is just a two-part question to see if what we're witnessing is just more of the same, or is it different in some way?
Well, let me just start with the public. I think, certainly since the early 2000s, I think that public attitudes towards Israel have gotten increasingly negative. And again, that's certainly true among younger people, and that's certainly true inside the Democratic Party. And what's going on here is that you now have an alternative media that allows people to criticize Israel and to expose what Israel is doing in greater Israel. So people don't rely on the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal for all their news, right? There are just all sorts of other sites on the internet that you can go to and get a ton of information about what's going on inside of greater Israel. And it's therefore very hard for Israel supporters to hide what is happening to the Palestinians. And this really matters. So the word is out. And then when you have a conflict like the one that's now taking place in Gaza, right, and everybody's paying attention to what's going on, this is going to have a negative effect on Israel's image in the West. In fact, it's going to probably cause a spike in negativity. So I think the key point here is it's an evolutionary process, right? And because of the internet, and because of the demographic composition of the American population over time, that Israel's position in the public is going to deteriorate. And I would argue it's probably going to deteriorate in significant ways. I think 20, 25 years from now, Israel will be seen by the public in quite negative ways. The elites are a different matter. And I think the lobby will continue to target the elites and go to great lengths to make sure that every policymaker is deeply committed to supporting Israel unconditionally. They'll have some failures for sure. They already have this with the so-called squad, and there are a few other outliers in Congress as well. But by and large, they've been very successful. And the question you have to ask yourself is, if the body politic begins to turn against Israel in a fundamental way, will this have an effect at the elite level? Will we see policymakers coming into office or politicians, moving into positions of power in Washington who are willing to challenge Israel and challenge the lobby? I wouldn't bet on it. I'm not a good judge of these things because, in a way, I'm too deep in the forest and I've seen the lobby succeed too many times. But I wouldn't bet that public opinion will change to the point where politicians begin to change their views. Again, this is one of those areas or one of those subjects where I hope that I'm dead wrong. But I think you do not want to underestimate how powerful the lobby is, right? And how spineless most Americans most American politicians are. There's hardly anybody who's willing to stand up to the lobby. You look around Washington and you start thinking about when they write the next version of Profiles in Courage, how many of these people are going to be in that book? The answer is probably about none of them. And the Question is that going to change? I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. And I think the lobby understands that, by the way. I think they understand they can play smash mouth politics. They can do this out in the open, and it doesn't matter. They can get away with it because nobody's going to stand up to them at the elite level. Yeah, there are going to be a lot of people down below, people like me, who are complaining and trying to point out what's wrong about this present situation. But they believe we're not going to get too far because we're not going to have much effect on policymakers. And in fact, policymakers are going to go to great lengths to stay away from people like me and people like Steve Walt. Do you ever think Barack Obama would have me or Steve Walt on the National Security Council? Do you ever think that a senator or a congressman would advertise that he or she talks to me or Steve Walt? They'd be a fool to do that, right? For reasons we all understand. This is life in America. And the question is it going to change? And I'm pessimistic, at least for the foreseeable future. I hope I'm wrong again.
What you're saying when you're pessimistic also, though, John, is that the quality of American democracy is going to erode even further, right? If the lobby and moneyed interests and politicians can wall themselves off from a growing generationally obviously inflected majority that is much more critical of Israel. This is a problem for our democracy more generally, no?
I think about this in the context of freedom of speech. And I think about it today with regard to universities, right? What's going on here is that the lobby's going to enormous length. And by the way, if you read our book, the lobby has been at this game for a long time. It's just much more visible now. It's my point about smash mouth politics. In the past, the lobby was able to quietly affect discourse in academia. But the idea that we have freedom of speech on university campuses about Israel is belied by the facts, right? Shibli Telhami did a survey recently where all sorts of academics ended up telling his survey that they self-censor when it comes to talking about the Middle East and especially talking about Israel, because people understand that if they talk about Israel in critical ways, the lobby will come after them hammer and tongue. If you want evidence of that, I can take my shirt off and show you the bullet holes in my body, right? And Steve Walt can do likewise. The lobby will come after you. So what we see going on now, with the Claudine Gay incident and the Penn incident is, a serious move by the lobby to curb free speech on university campuses. And this is true in the broader public as well. The lobby goes to great lengths to prevent people from criticizing Israel. When was the last time you saw somebody criticize Israel on public TV or on national public radio? It hardly ever happens. The Wall Street Journal, it's unthinkable that the Wall Street Journal would run an article that was at all critical of Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians, or made the argument that Israel is engaged in murder. The lobby goes to great lengths to police the discourse, and this has profound effects for freedom of speech. And this, to go back to where you started, is terribly unhealthy for a democracy. And it's one of the reasons that we are in real trouble as a society.
Just one last question, if you don't mind. And we really appreciate your generosity, John, and staying with us and asserting that you're available. That's really appreciated. And we say this to all of our guests who stay beyond an hour or 70 minutes, 75 minutes. So, do you think the wave of accusations and criminalization of this of critique of Israel, do you think this wave is something that will subside after I don't even know how to say after this is over, because what's happening is so traumatic. But do you think this will subside eventually, and the kinds of criminalization, especially of critique being anti-Semitic, and the conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or anti-Israel policies, you think this is something that how is it affected by what is going on, with an eye to Israel's massacres on the ground?
Yeah, this is another one of these great questions. Let's assume that at some point the military campaign uh, now taking place in Gaza comes to an end. Um, the question is, what happens with the Gaza issue and the Israel issue more generally? Uh, and my view is that this is not going to go away. Uh, and there's going to be a lot of discussion of the issues that we're talking about today regarding Israel and the Palestinians for the foreseeable future. Now, you ask me, why do I say that? First of all, there's no simple solution to the Gaza problem. We didn't get into this. This is another one of these subjects that I've spent a lot of time studying. The Israelis are not going to defeat Hamas. Hamas is going to remain intact. It's going to remain a formidable force inside of Gaza. And as long as that's the case, there is no pretty solution, no simple solution from an Israeli point of view to shutting down future trouble from Gaza. So Gaza is going to be a festering wound in Israel's side for a long period of time. And that is going to bring a lot of attention to Israel and to Gaza and to the Palestinians. Furthermore, the question you have to ask yourself as well, the other question you have to ask yourself as well, is what happens inside Israel itself? What happens as a result of what's going on in Gaza and other factors as well? Israel is a country that has powerful centrifugal forces at play inside of it. As I'm sure both of you know, before October 7th, there was much talk of a civil war inside of Israel because of this basic law that the government actually did push through that limited the power of the judiciary. It caused a huge amount of trouble. Now there's a big battle taking place inside Israel on whether or not there should be a commission set up to examine the IDF's failures on October 7th. There's also a big battle taking place inside the cabinet in Israel on what to do with Gaza once the war ends or once the shooting starts. There's huge disagreement, right? Furthermore, there's the whole question of Hezbollah. Furthermore, there's the whole fact that Israel is an apartheid state, which has become increasingly clear. And the question of what this means for settling the Israel-Palestinian conflict is front and center these days and is not going to go away. People are going to be talking about a two-state solution, this kind of solution, that kind of solution. More and more people are going to be talking about the fact that Israel is an apartheid state. And furthermore, to make matters worse, the Israelis, who are actually trying to ethnically cleanse the West Bank in a more subtle way than they're trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza, are going to continue to try to cleanse the West Bank. They're going to try to push out all of the Palestinians from the occupied territories. This issue is not going away. So I would argue that if you look at Gaza and you look at the West Bank and what the future holds for those two pieces of territory, and you look at the Israeli society, the Israeli body politic, you just see lots of trouble for as far as the eye can see. I mean, the fact is that Israel is a country that is in really deep trouble. right? And I think, from reading the Israeli press, lots of people understand that. There is no simple way out here. And the fact that, to go back to where we started, that we're talking about a situation where on January 11th, Israel is going to have to appear before the International Court of Justice to make the case that it's not engaged in genocide really tells you something powerful about where Israel is as a society. So anyway, all of this is a long-winded way of saying to you, Bassam, that I think that even after the shooting stops and the dust begins to settle, that these issues are going to garner a huge amount of attention.
I thanks, John. I can't help but recognize that even in our conversation, and of course it was addressed, but there's this notion out there that uh, if the war stops, if this onslaught stops, if this slaughter stops, we can call it whatever we want, depending on people's orientations. We still go back to the basic structure, which is not one of two actors that are sovereign fighting it out. We go back to the
Yeah.
structure and the reality of military occupation, systematic dispossession, uh, systematic ethnic cleansing, which means, in according to international law and various conventions, armed resistance is legal, provided certain contours and caveats. So when all this mayhem that we are witnessing brought about for the past 3 months, um, primarily by Israel after the attack of October 7th, are we supposed to be content with just peace or the absence of killing from a humanitarian slash moral point of view, or is there something that you find necessary as us as human beings, as educators, activists, human rights uh, personnel, international organizations? Does this increase the pressure on dealing with the problem that has sort of been erased from public discussions, especially in the United States? That is, the starting point is not what people say. There was a ceasefire and Hamas broke it on October 7th. There was there were conditions of structural domination lasting more than 75 years or around 75 years. So what closing with this, where do you
Well,
think things should be after the killing stops?
well, just I want to be very clear on this. Uh, I hope the killing stops. I mean, I hope the military campaign now being waged in Gaza stops very soon. I mean, I think what's happening here, it's horrible, absolutely horrible. So, I mean, I agree completely with what you said, and I tried to say it myself that after the shooting stops, it's not going to be harmony by any means. There's going to be huge trouble in the years ahead. I clearly understand that, but I think it's imperative that we do everything we can to shut this one down uh, as soon as possible, because this is a genocide. Or, and if you don't think it's a genocide, at least it's a case of mass murder. It's murder on a huge scale, and this needs to be shut down, in my humble opinion, immediately. Okay, but to go back to the question of what happens afterwards, look, Israel, you didn't use the word. I'll use the word. Israel is an apartheid state, right? Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is a distinguished human rights organization inside of Israel, all three of those human rights organizations have written lengthy reports which lay out in detail why Israel is an apartheid state. And I think there's no question about that. And we have inside Greater Israel, we have inside Greater Israel about 7.3 million Palestinians and about 7.3 million Jews. We have rough equality. And the only way that the Israelis can deal with that situation is to have an apartheid state, right? Because if they go to democracy, if you have a democratic one state solution, that one state will end up being a Palestinian state. And the Israeli Jews are never going to accept that, right? So you get apartheid. And by the way, just to get off topic for a second, this is why ethnic cleansing is so attractive to the Israelis, because ethnic cleansing is seen as the solution to apartheid. But anyway, back to apartheid. You have an apartheid state in Greater Israel. You have two populations that are of roughly equal size, and one wants to dominate the other. And it does dominate it in a cruel and systematic way, right? And needless to say, the victims are not going to take that sitting down, or at least not all of them are. And you're going to get a first intifada, you're going to get a second intifada, and you're going to get October 7th. And this is likely to happen again and again and again. And the question is, how can the Israelis get out of this situation? And the argument that Steve, Walt, and I made in the article and in the book, and we've made over time, and many other people have made, is that the Israelis should have accepted a two-state solution a long time ago, and they should have gone to great lengths to give the Palestinians a viable state of their own, and worked overtime and worked with the United States to work out some sort of meaningful modus vivendi between those two states. Now, lots of American presidents understood that. They understood that. Going back to Jimmy Carter and marching forward, virtually every president understood that the best solution, not a good solution, but the best solution to putting an end to this, or trying to put an end to it, was to create a two-state solution. But we could never get to first base. We couldn't even get out of the batter's box in trying to implement a two-state solution. Why? Because of the lobby. Ask Barack Obama about that. He'll tell you about the scars he has on his body, right? So we were unsuccessful. Now, can you imagine a two-state solution now? It's impossible to imagine a two-state solution, especially given where Israel is at this point in time. Just look at the composition of the cabinet that runs Israel, and then just think about what's happened since October 7th. Two-state solution? So where does that leave you? It leaves you with an apartheid state. And it leaves you, as I said before, with a festering problem in Gaza. It leaves you with a festering problem on your northern flank vis-a-vis Hezbollah. It leaves you with a festering problem in the West Bank. And at the same time, because of alternative media, because of the internet, because of cameras on iPhones, it's very easy for the rest of the world to see what you're doing. And the United States may support you, but the question you have to ask yourself is, the United States going to be there forever? And I tend to think that's true, but maybe not. And so I think from Israel's point of view, they're in deep trouble. They made, in my humble opinion, the Israelis made a huge mistake not moving to a two-state solution, or at least not attempting to facilitate a two-state solution. And the lobby bears much responsibility for that failure on the part of the United States to get Israel to move in that direction.
Thank you so much, John, for your insights as well as your generosity. Lisa and I both really appreciate it. I'll give the last word to Lisa. Um, we wish that more and more people, especially in our field, three of us in political science, speak out with the same integrity, or would speak out with the same integrity and courage that you are, at least in terms of the gap between professed principles and what we are observing. Um, we hope to speak with you again or maybe we shouldn't hope to speak with you again, so that there would be an occasion for it. But
That would be
we really enjoyed this. A lot of people have sent tons of messages online on various platforms. There's simply no way we can get to the, at least to the even to the productive questions. We apologize to everyone. We will continue our project with various teachings, seminars, and lectures and podcasts. And everything can be accessed on palestineincontext.org. Thanks, Lisa, for being my partner in crime. And I'll leave the
Thank you.
last word to you.
Just, I want to reiterate what Bassam has said. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Bassam, for organizing this platform for fruitful conversation. And John Mearsheimer, thank you very much for your generosity and your lucidity. It's really pretty exceptional, and it's delightful to have you on. I hope there will be a time when we could have you on to talk about something less depressing.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for the terrific questions and giving me the opportunity to answer all of them. And I only hope that it makes a difference moving forward.